who was here and gave 3 presentations, first about the native wind tune and then the California family. So this is an extension of that, and welcome, and we look forward to hearing and learning from you.
Thank you for the invitation. It's very nice.
Thank you.
I'm Kendall, and my mother was Emily Kendall. So my first name is Kendall. Kendall family came from Berryessa, and they were there prior to that side of my mom's side, at least California. But my other part of the other side of the family, the Berryessa family, came up with Anza on the expedition. They were 2 brother and sister, and the sister was about 18 at that time, almost considered an old maid. Nicholas Antonio was about 12, but knew how to handle animals with leather and saddlery because his father was a saddler in Sinaloa. Well, they walked up all 1,200 miles, no riding. The only animals carried the soldiers, and the people all walked. So if you were a mom and had babies, you were carrying the baby. So there's 2 kids that were walking. One of them was named Nicholas Antonio Berryessa, and the other was Maria Gertrude Peralta. When they got to Oakland, they got married. They weren't in Oakland, I'm sorry. When they got to Carmel, they got married. They ended up living up in Oakland, Peralta. But later, when they had their child, Nasaria, he married Maria Berryessa, who was a converted Indian from the Carmel Mission. They had a daughter on January 1st, 1825. She was actually born December 31st, 1824. It took them a day to get to church to get her baptized and written in the book. And her name is #1 first person in the ledger for 1825, so she was easy to find. So that lady is the lady who's in the middle of the picture, and you guys came in late. So in the middle of the picture where the lady holding the baby, that's Clara Berryessa. There's a plaque about her being the first pioneer in California in near a town called Willows, on its way to Elk Creek, which is outside of Willows. In Elk Creek, there is a small town that no longer exists. You can see it because there's some old orchard trees on the hill, and it's called Fruto, Fruto. This picture that you're looking at was given to me by the gravekeeper in Willows for my great-great-great-grandmother's grave, which is here. I'm passing it around. But to jump forward, she's married right next to her son, Napoleon Vallejo. We'll get to that. The place where Fruto was is where she lived. That's where this picture was taken. And the gravekeeper up there had a whole bunch of things there. And so my background is University of California. That's my degree. I graduated with a senior thesis, which was very difficult. The senior thesis topic was the aboriginal trade routes of California Indians. I found there were only 8 axe heads, for instance, in California. Very interesting, because none of them originated in California. I found the Mojave and the Modoc from the north were really the only Indians that traveled in California, and that there was value in the Indian culture. When I mean value, if you had an obsidian knife or a deer skin, that was of value. And usually the chief or the leader had the most value. I'm going to read just a short thing to put you in perspective. This was written in 1892. It's a newspaper article. They wrote in newspaper articles about mundane things. And I learned through my struggles to do my senior thesis that you had to go into the library and spend hours reading, and you get this. So here, Clara and Jesse Beasley are parents of Nancy Small, Kate Carruthers, Carol, and Carrie Culver. Carrie, in parentheses, is Gussie in your picture. It says Mrs. Sam Culver and family, Mrs. Walter Culver and family, Mrs. Carruthers and family, and Mrs. Small and family were passengers on the Fruto train. That's in the middle of nowhere. What's a train doing in Fruto? Yesterday afternoon, their destination being the home of Mrs. Beasley in Fruto, that home that you're looking at right there. The father of the three last mentioned ladies were there, and there was a pleasant reunion family with them. That was newspaper. That was newspaper. I'm going to digress a little bit in a minute, but I want to point out that I've learned in everything, and I know that you guys all being historians just like me. I'm a lay historian, so are you. But there's history and there's fact. I found out, for instance, that they're celebrating the discovery of San Francisco on June 28th, when in fact it was October 11th. This was written in the 40s that proves it, and it started with a guy who wrote it in 1911 named Herbert Bolton. Bolton is who first translated all the Spanish diaries, primarily for Bancroft, but by then Bancroft is gone. But he was translating it as an academic, and he got a lot of it wrong. A lot. There's two authors who have done an incredible job. And before I get to that, I want to point out, this is a book, Mission Tales in the Days of the Dons. There's a couple of stories in here that just cracks me up about a priest who goes forward to all the missions because there's some young men on horses. Who knows who they are? They're in here, but I don't know. And they are dedicated to go get a girl from every mission to commit to marry. So you find the funniest story. This is Days of the Dons. This is the original account of this lone woman of St. Nicholas Island. Very short read. Unbelievable tale. Unbelievable. This one I love dearly because it influenced the entire society. We're going to talk about that in a minute. It's a game book of Native Indians. This is a very rare find. You can't find this. They're like hard to find cheap. They don't print it. It's grass games and moon races, and it actually describes football that was played by American Indians before football was done. So there's just little things, and in here, this is written and done. It's recollections and paintings and drawings of early Indians and Fiona. And if you don't read it, you don't pick up that one little tidbit of information. So I've left some things for Kim. I just wanted to show you that I probably have maybe 600 books myself. I've read at least 1,000, and I can't even tell you, I don't think that's a good number. When I was in the Bancroft Library. And then you just keep moving, so you forget. Yes. I'm going to do something now in a minute, but there's two people that I want to acknowledge. It's Rosemary Beebe and Robert Sienkiewicz. They are professors, and they retranslated all of Bolton's work, corrected it. So we have a different vision now of what happened and what was going on.
They just released this 1,500 page on the left required. Well, these are the requirements. These are the records that he wrote, and these are letters. And they're doing one more that's going to be the love letters between Francisca and Mariano Vallejo. This is Vallejo. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you guys a presentation, and I'm going to apologize up front because I'm going to be reading it. If you see this picture here, now you guys can look at this later, I'll leave it. This is the lady in the middle. That's Clara Berryessa, so it's all over family. This is Napoleon Vallejo, her son. Napoleon and I forget the other son's name. She had 2 children by Salvador, Mariano's brother. Mariano convinced his brother to get rid of Clara. She later married Beasley. That's why her name is Beasley, but she's got a son named Napoleon. One of Mariano's children was named Napoleon. They all switched names. So how does this connect with Dixon? The Bear Flag Revolution happened when Mariano Vallejo and Sixto Berryessa were jailed in Sonoma. They then, Kit Carson and John Fremont went down to San Rafael, and right at the Narrows in between Point Richmond and San Rafael is where the DeHaro twins, which are a daughter of Berryessa's children, and the DeHaro twins, who were the first Algave for San Francisco, and Juan Jose Berryessa, their uncle and the brother of Sixto. They were going up to Sonoma to celebrate his birthday. Kit Carson and John Fremont shot them dead. I'm not going to go into the story today because we have more important things to do. And later, they took the bearskin coat off of Juan Jose, and they took it back to Sonoma and they raised it on the flag. Sixto saw the bear coat and recognized it. He said, "There's blood on it, and my father's dead." And they go, "Yes." He go, "That's his coat, and I want it." He said, "No." But they negotiated, and he paid 25 pesos for his dead father's coat. As a result, they put up a rag, a white rag, with a bear that looked more like a pig, they say, up, and that became the Bear Flag Revolution. Now you know the real story. But I need 2 volunteers. I need someone, maybe you, and how about you? Can you come up here? That's a more comfortable chair. Here, let's use this chair. We're gonna have a little fun, okay? Okay. Now, if you don't mind, I'm gonna take my shirt off. And I don't want the girls to get too excited, but nobody knew that. I always advertise. Alta California is what Californianos called themselves. The first newspaper was Alta California. Mariano wrote this book, and I read some of it. This is a lot. I have a script that I'm going to read, and I have a place for you and a place for you. And I see it too. When I get to here and I look at you, that's what you're going to read. When there's 1 dot, that's what you're going to read. You're a 2, you're a 1. Oh, I'm a 1 dot. Yeah. I apologize up front for not just standing here and telling you apart, but I want to get the words specific. Rosemarie Beebe and Robert Sienkiewicz gave this presentation to the Los Californianos in June of this year, when they released the book. The Los California group is very close with them. We're all basically Vallejo, ancestors of Vallejo. So I'm going to go ahead and start. Now you're going through, that's good. See, that's not cool. But at the very end, that's you. That's important. So again, I apologize. I'm going to read because the words are very specific. Vallejo would be delighted to be remembered all of these years later and to have his record of life be published, showing how early Californianos were a civilized, educated people. In the early 1830s, Vallejo was closely associated with the San Francisco Presidio. In the early 1830s, he was appointed paymaster and thereafter appointed as acting commandant for the Presidio. Even though he spent a considerable amount of time in Southern California as a supporter of Jose de Quijada during the time of political uncertainty from 1831 to 1833. Even though Vallejo was still formally associated with the families of the San Francisco Presidio. And because of this association, the governor sent Vallejo on a common mission to Fort Ross in 1833. The trip eventually led to this becoming the communato for the secularization of the Mission San Francisco Cubano in 1835. Vallejo laid out a plan for the plaza in Sonoma. He served in Sonoma as a military commandant for most of the period of the next Mexican era. At times as commander of most of the Northern District, and at other times as commander of Alta California as a whole. It was in Sonoma that Vallejo was arrested in 1846 at the Bear Flag Revolt. After he was released and the Americans took over, the U.S. military chief named Vallejo a sub-agent for what they call the Indians on the north side of the bay in San Francisco. Vallejo served as a delegate to Sonoma at the 1849 Constitutional Convention in Monterey, and he represented Sonoma as a member of the state senate and the first California legislature. During the late 1850s and the early 1860s, Vallejo served twice as mayor of Sonoma, and even as he lost most of his land to squatters and to court rulings during the subsequent decades, he retained the public position as a leading citizen of the North Bay and as one of the most important Californianos with an active public life before the U.S. conquest. That well-known reputation was why he was contacted by the renowned Hubert Bancroft in the late 1870s. And this contact led Vallejo to produce the most comprehensive, most detailed history of Alta California written by any who lived in the region and in this region before the U.S. takeover. The complete translation of his words reveals the history and events of the time better than anything ever yet found, and I will attest. But Vallejo's interest was in his homeland history. It predated Bancroft's contact with him. During the first decade of American rule, Vallejo became acutely aware for the generalized disdain about Mexico and Mexicans that newly arrived Americans felt for them. And so he decided to compose a history of pre-US California history. And as doing this, he mentioned to a friend what he was doing. And so that the American might realize when they took over the country, there was a civilization, and then they belonged to a group who were equal, if not better, to them than theirs. I don't know if I translated that properly, but that's what they said. Vallejo believed in a combination of the military, political, and family experiences in Alta California. Before, during, and after the U.S. takeover, had given Vallejo a unique, important perspective of California's past. As he told a British travel writer in 1874, A writer had sought him out, so he was known. My biography is the history of California. However, a fire in 1867 at his Casa Grande on the Sonoma Plaza destroyed his manuscript, and Vallejo sadly and reluctantly put down the project. His wife, Francesca, wrote to her daughter about the fire, and this is what she said.
Yesterday at 3:30 in the afternoon, the Casa Grande in Sonoma burned down. The house in which we lived in for so many years, the house that your father built with his own hands so that we could all live here together. I cried as if one of my children had died. That house is where my children were raised, where you all left your marks and scribbles on the wall when you were little, and as the house was burning, I went to watch to say goodbye. For 4 hours, Napoleon and I were the only ones watching it as it burned to the ground. Your father and uncle refused to go see it burn. People from all over the valley were in the plaza. It almost seemed like a party atmosphere, but all were trying valiantly to save our home. They worked so hard to try and put out that fire.
Even though Vallejo's manuscript did not survive the fire, original parts of the manuscript did. In the spring of 1874, Enrique Cerruti, ever heard that name? A member of Bancroft's staff visited Vallejo. The purpose of this visit was to try to gain access to the documents that had survived the Casa Grande fire. Because Bancroft wanted to use these papers as a source of information, he was acquiring to produce his own manuscript on the history of California. Now, Vallejo, being the smart guy he was, he saw Cerruti's visit as a real opportunity, and he therefore agreed to share a few of his documents on the condition that he could dictate to Cerruti his personal recollections of the history of Alta California. Bancroft's strong desire to eventually gain access to those documents led him to agree. Vallejo worked for a year and a half proposing his history, which totaled 5 volumes. On August 23rd, 1875, he wrote a letter to his wife, and he exclaimed, "This week I will finish this." Vallejo believed that his history was a unique contribution to the understanding of the Californian past and present. Less than a month after Vallejo began to collaborate with Cerruti, Vallejo told Cerruti that his manuscript will contain material that was very different than what other people had written about the Californian past. And he was absolutely correct. Vallejo's final manuscript focused on a group of things that he believed was crucial for a full and complete understanding of the California experience. He believed that each of these things was significant to Alta California before the U.S. takeover. He also believed that his own family's experience in the U.S. California demonstrated that these themes continued to be relevant after California ceased to become part of the Spanish Empire and part of the Mexican Republic. Vallejo believed that by appreciating these things, the Anglos who now ruled California, might better understand California's past history, its present calamities, and its future possibilities. He foresaw how great California was back then. And in this presentation, we will focus on 4 of these things. First, Vallejo emphasized the role that the ordinary soldier had in the settlement of Alta California and creating the possibilities for the eventual culturation of California's indigenous peoples. Now, the emphasis on this theme of ordinary soldiers was a conscious effort on his part to contest a mission-centric interpretation of California's past that was developing in the Golden State. The incipient popularity in the 1870s of paintings and photographs of mission ruins by people like Reynard Wild and Carlton Watkins and others was already laying groundwork for the Spanish revival movement, which emphasized and romanticized visions of California's mission past. It was already occurring in the 1860s and 70s. Vallejo argued that soldiers were just as important as missionaries, and in some cases, even more so. At the start of the Recuerdos here, he praised the efforts of the sacrificing military men who, along with the aid of the missionaries, were able to free this beautiful land from the hands of the barbarous.
He insisted, "My troops are, in my opinion, just as deserving of being considered worthy conquerors of Alta California as a venerable missionary, and that his selfless men who accompanied him and under his supervision founded the missions in this land."
Vallejo stressed that the common soldiers that served in this area were dedicated, hardworking, and selfless. Overall, in Vallejo's view,
The garrisons in Los Californianos teamed with soldiers of integrity and discipline.
he aimed a thinly veiled attack upon the squatters who overran many ranchos in the 1850s. He insisted that these soldiers, even when they were not paid regularly, never showed disrespect to the ownership of private property. It is also important to note that Vallejo also praised the performance of non-soldiers such as artisans, farmers, rancheros, printers, and of course, women. For example, he made a point of mentioning Cayetano Exara, a mule driver who brought mules and horses over a great distance from Sonora in northern Mexico to Monterrey. Even though, as Vallejo said,
There were no known roads in the area traveled for this journey, and which was filled with barbarous Indians.
Vallejo insisted that such a dedication persisted into subsequent generations. He cited the example of the Monterrey Rancho owner, Francisco Pacheco, and even though Pacheco possessed immense numbers of cattle, he worked as a poor artisan and he shared the fruits of his labors with the sick. And he was thinking about Jose Manuel Verona, who was a corporal in the military, but also a carpenter and a teacher in San Francisco and Monterrey. But Vallejo made a point that Verona married
One of the first girls born in the Pueblo de San Jose de Guadalupe, who ended up operating a store in the Monterrey region known as La Tienda de Kia Veranda.
That's the Verona adobe in Salinas. It was Vallejo's view that one of the most important institutions in Spanish and Mexican California was the Presidio. He said bluntly,
Without the Presidio, the missionaries would not be able to exist.
now, a century and a half later, much popular and even some in historical writing still regard the missionaries, whether with praise or toleration or vilified as the overwhelmingly permanent Hispanic actors in Spanish and Mexican California. That's a direct quote. I think I know what they're saying, and I think you guys do too. Vallejo would strongly disagree. He would argue that the soldiers had the competing role in the colonial task of enculturating the indigenous people of California. Enculturating was one of the words I wanted to make sure I got right. Even though this task was designed to encourage admission, where becoming Catholic and learning Spanish style of agriculture was supposed to turn the neophytes into productive members in the Spanish Empire, Vallejo believed that no such process occurred. He said that the missionaries never implicated the neophytes with any principles regarding the rights of any acculturation, and if any acculturation did occur, it was because some of the soldiers married indigenous women. Vallejo correctly said that even Sarah, that's Father Sarah, who generally did not like he didn't like the military much at all. He generally approved of such unions, meaning the soldiers marrying the girls, their role in the colonial process. Now, Vallejo had a personal experience with another pain, which was the crucial role of ordinary people in cultural assimilation. He understood that even though the era from 1769 to 1821 was called the Spanish era, the overwhelming non-English speaking people in Alta California were not Spaniards, but rather people who came from the viceroyalty of New Spain They were, in other words, Mexican. He and his wife were not Spaniards, Vallejo. They were Mexican. As they and their family were becoming foreigners in the land of their birth, they were trying to adjust to the new order of life. After 1848, the marriages of their children were a crucial part of that process. It is interesting that none of the Vallejo children married a Californian. This caused a little bit of resentment from Vallejo and his wife Francisca, because it appeared to them that their now Mexican-American children were disregarding Mexican tradition relating to marriage. There did not appear to be any problems initially with the first marriage that occurred in the family between their oldest daughter, Fanny, who we call Fanny, and the American soldier named John Frisbee. Frisbee converted to Catholicism 1 year before the marriage. With a celebration at the mission in Sonoma, he later functioned, by the way, as Vallejo's lawyer and financial advisor through the 1860s and thereafter. But the next family wedding played out a lot different. In the later 1860s, while Vallejo was attending his late mother's estate in Monterey area, which he seemed to be doing for a long time, Vallejo's younger daughter, Adela, told her mother she was going to get married to John Frisbee's older brother, Levi, who was 16 years older than she was. Both parents tried to convince her not to marry. Vallejo with a letter from Monterey, and her mother with daily discussions in person. Francesca begged her husband in letters to return and help the problem, to help solve the problem. She wrote,
Come. You say that you love me and that the family so much, but now when I need you, why do you leave me here for so long without your guidance?
but Vallejo stayed in Monterey. Adela's response from her parents' concern was that she should not be bound by the traditional Mexican customs of contracting marriage only after getting permission from one's parents. And she added that she suspected that her own parents did not fully adhere to that custom themselves when they decided. When Francisca finally realized that her daughter's mind was made up, she took her to San Francisco to buy an expensive wedding gown with money she borrowed from her husband's lawyer in San Francisco. Adela invited her father to the wedding. For Mariano Guadalupe, the adjustments to the new American social norm was proving to be much more difficult than he had foreseen. But Adele's marriage was not the end of Vallejo's difficulties with his daughter's nuptial choices. In 1863, the next two daughters, Natalia and Tobita, informed their mother that they intended to marry another set of brothers. Attila and Hartho Herzarthi were the sons of the pioneering wine grower Augusta Herzarthi, who had just established the Buena Vista winery just outside of Sonoma. I think we all probably know that. A few years earlier, after receiving a letter from Natalia, Vallejo, who was once again in Monterey figuring out what to do with his mother's estate, sourly remarked,
"It is very strange that whenever I come to Monterey, the girls always want to get married and others inform me of this before I know anything. And I have been assured that Tobita is also engaged to one of the other Harsathy young men. I've been not told this directly from my own daughter."
Now, Vallejo did attend this double wedding, and it was held on the 1st of June, 1863, and it was performed by a Catholic priest. Hubert Bancroft was not the only Bancroft who interacted with Vallejo. Kate Bancroft, his 14-year-old daughter, accompanied her father to the Vallejo home in 1874. Kate kept a journal of her travels, and her entries are delightful. And I did go back and read all of her entries, and it's very fun to read what a 14-year-old girl says. You're seeing everything through the eyes of a 14-year-old girl, and it is quite refreshing to read. This is how Vallejo was described through Kate's eyes.
We drove up a long avenue, about half a mile, I should think, On both sides were locust trees and arched rose bushes between them. The whole place is beautiful. When we arrived, there was a fence surrounding a very pretty garden with a fountain in the middle. For their house, there was a row of locust trees. The flowers were long and white and very pretty and smelled wonderful. The rose bushes were growing taller than I am. I should think somewhere around 6 feet tall. The verbenas too were lovely. All the flowers were growing and beautiful. General Vallejo took us all around the place and gave us some oranges. We had orange trees, fig trees, apple trees, strawberries, all kinds of things I can name. Tropical fruits and other fruits all over there too.
Later, you can hear another case description of Vallejo itself. It's quite interesting. Justice in Vallejo's attitude relating to his daughter's marriages continued to be difficult. Decades later, when his daughter Maria, they had 8 children. 8. Their first child was named Andronico. He died in childbirth. The second child was a male also. They named him Andronico. Okay. Maria was, decades later, when his daughter Maria was being courted by a San Franciscan named James Harry Cutter. Does that name ring a bell? We can talk about that later. He wrote to Francisco.
When I arrived here in San Francisco, I began to inquire of the family of the young man who wants to marry Maria, and all seems to be capable.
But he was not happy about the American customs and circumstances of the planned wedding. A few months later, when he happened to be in San Francisco hotel room with both Maria and Cutter, he was deeply offended by the way they were behaving with each other. He told Francisca,
Maria and the young man Cutter, they have angered me. They are silly and imprudent and believe they already can do anything they want in my presence.
Mariano Guadalupe was learning the enculturation was turning out to be a much more difficult process than he had anticipated. Indeed, Francisca and Californiana, that's another daughter. Their daughter lived in California, were much more close to the girls than her husband was, and spent more time with them than he did, and seemed to handle this part of the process much better. Now, the second thing, and we're almost done. We're getting done. The recuerdos, in the recuerdos, it was Vallejo's insistence that the desire for cultural and intellectual advancement was integral to life in Alta California during the Mexican period. He was keenly aware of this. Vallejo bristled most intensely in his manuscript when he described ways in which foreigners in Mexican California, mainly but not exclusively New Americans, regarded California as an uncivilized and uncouth group of people. He told a story of Pedro Estrada, who in 1840s Monterey demonstrated an amazing natural ability to play the piano. The governor said public money should be sent to Estrada so that he could go to Mexico City and learn how to play formally. But a prominent Monterey Scottish person named Spence thought differently on this matter and insisted that it would be
an utter waste of money to pay teachers to teach music to young boys. It would be better if the boys learned a useful trade in order to get a job.
Now, does that sound about right? Vallejo himself had personal experience with pianos. In fact, this piano was one of 3 pianos brought to California from the East Coast in 1843. Vallejo bought one of the pianos in 1844. The piano remained largely unused, as happens in life, until March 1846, when Vallejo hired Andrew Kuttner, a German who had worked with the Russians in Sitka, Alaska. He hired Kuttner to teach his children how to play the piano. According to the contract, Kuttner was to teach the girls and the boys, and in exchange for piano lessons, Vallejo offered Kuttner a part of a rancho owned slightly north of Sonoma, Rancho Agua Caliente. Within a year and a half, the American military visitor named Harry Wise to the Casa Grande, came to the Casa Grande. He stated that the Vallejo children could play the piano remarkably well. The oldest child, Andronico, actually became a professional music teacher, and several other children displayed excellent skills. Tolita and Natalia continued their study of music at St. Mary's Hall in Sonoma and in San Francisco, and they both became accomplished piano players and singers. Vallejo showed his support for Tolita's musical talents in a very sweet and clever way. In 1862, he drew up a contract with Tolita. The terms of the contract was that she was to give guitar lessons to her brothers, Enrique and Pudisal, for the period of 1 year, and the payment was to be from her brothers, 1 cow and 1 horse. The animals were for hers to take care of and hers alone. What they're saying is in between the lines. This is a darling and clever, this was darling and clever. Tolita's talent was well known in Sonoma and in the San Francisco area, and she sang often the Ada Maria in both places. In 1877, Vallejo wrote to Francisca about Tolita from San Francisco that Tolita had sung in the French church, that's the French Catholic Church, and her performance was well received. For Vallejo, his children's experiences and accomplishments demonstrated that what he firmly believed, being a Californiano and a culture person, were not at all at odds with each other. Indeed, Vallejo argued that the family orientation of Californiano culture made it superior to the more individual focus of the Anglo in the 19th century. As he was describing the evacuation of women and children from Monterey during the 1818 Bouchard raid, which Monterey was bombed, the evacuation which he himself took part in.
There were wives who refused to be separated from their husband and children, who threw themselves in the arms of their father, saying, "Papa, why won't they let me die with you?"
Vallejo believed that this behavior sprang from deep in the souls of old Californians who believed that the love of family was far more important than any calculated plan of vile self-interest.
If they had been Yankees, they would probably have behaved quite differently.
In addition to his remarks about cultural attainment and cultural achievement, Vallejo also insisted that Californianos were very interested in education. He argued that the governors of Spanish and Mexican California were extremely interested in creating significant educational opportunity for the children of the region, of the region. But the lack of trained instructors meant that soldiers, often with only rudimentary skills in reading and writing, were occasionally recruited as teachers. And the results were not always very good. The Pentecostal method employed by some of the soldiers were often more like military styles of discipline, and these methods did not impart the love of learning in the students. Vallejo described one particularly painful recollection that involved penmanship lessons. Since the examination of students' handwriting practices was conducted much like a review of truth, that is to say that the students would line up and present their work in succession to the teacher with a paddle in one hand. The paddle never left the schoolmaster's hands, and sounds of blows could be resonating up to 100 times in less than an hour or an hour and a half. So if there were errors, he just whacked. So in a letter to his Vacon, Vallejo said that there were exceptions to this harsh Pentecostal practices. He began his letter.
Gracias a Dios, praising Bacon for finally writing his father in an intelligent and legible manner. He added that when his sisters saw the letter, the three of them explained in English quite an improvement. Vallejo then went on to say, in fact, it's an extraordinary improvement, even though nowadays it's not fashionable to write well and with clarity. Sending a letter filled with crossed out words and ink smears demonstrates a lack of civility.
He then proceeded to reminisce about his own handwriting experience.
With regard to handwriting, I remember that in the archives of California, there are some very old documents written by officers, Don Manuel Rodriguez and Jose Savillo. These documents are worth looking at to admire them. Very legible. He then goes on to say, Jose Savillo taught me to write with downward strokes. I even made handwriting examples that were sent to schools in Monterey, Santa Barbara, Santa Ynez, and San Diego.
This was in 1820, 21, and 22. And we all learned how to do those downward strokes. Vallejo insisted that the efforts of the governors during the Mexican era to improve education system in California was stifled by the Mexican government's reluctance to commit additional funding needed for the region. We still suffer that today. In addition, Vallejo argued the type of traditional religion that was taught in the schools did nothing to help the students develop their own independent moral character. In fact, he reserved special scorn for the 16th century catechism that was used in Monterey schools he attended. This catechism was written by Jesuit Geronimo de Herrera, and he underlined this in his recuerdos and put exclamation points on the front and the back. He said,
Father Rivaldo's Catechism, who among you does not know this monstrous and fanatical code we cannot even read? This code is like a venomous serpent who wraps itself around a young person's heart in order to slow the cow.
Vallejo was explicitly rejecting views that were currently in the United States about California, such as the statement that Alfred Robinson said in his book, Life in California. He said, the men are generally indolent and addicted to many vices, caring little for the welfare of their children, who like themselves grow up as unworthy members of society. Now was the case for cultural attainment. Vallejo argued about education derived from his family experiences. As a child growing up in Monterey himself, he received special tutoring from the governor, Pablo Vicente de Sola. Under de Sola's direction, he read books like Don Quixote, as well as contemporary newspapers he had received from Mexico City. And as an adult, he continued to collect as many books as he could. In his recuerdos, he commented that me and my friends hungered to know what men of science and intelligence in the old world are writing and thinking. But the desire was not supported or encouraged by the missionaries who kept close eye on the ports, coves, and inlets and shores so that books could not be imported which were written by liberals. Vallejo made arrangements with Captain Fitch to provide California with enlightenment-oriented books. He gleefully explained how Fitch smuggled the books ashore at night, leaving them at a place on the edge of the shore that they previously agreed on. The plan worked, and he wrote,
By 5 a.m., the books were safely in my care.
Vallejo boasted that he possessed the finest library in history, and he did. The finest library in California. The desire for a wide range of learning never left him, and when he became a father, he insisted that his sons and daughters were educated as well as possible. This manner of thinking made Vallejo somewhat unusual for the age for which he was living in and was born. The two youngest girls, Luisa and Maria, first attended St. Catherine's Convent in Benicia, then the Convent of Notre Dame in San Jose. Now, Francisca knew that her daughter's experiences were different than her own childhood a half a century earlier. At that time, they were hardly taught anything at all. The prayer for the faithful, the creed, and the novena to the Virgin. It was our parents' fault. It was that way things were done, Francisca wrote to Vallejo. Throughout her life, Francisca was very self-conscious and embarrassed about her own limited education. In a letter from 1863, you can see how she practices writing her husband's name at the top of the page. Guadalupe, 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 trying to make it legible as possible. But Francisca was a very strong woman. During the Bear Flag Rebellion, she secretly sent arms to Californianos in the countryside who were preparing to attack the Bear Flag stronghold in Sonoma. She was confronted by John C. Fremont himself, and he said, Senora, no, I want you to do it.
Senor, it's got one done.
Okay,
Senora, do you not realize you are deserving a very strong punishment for having supplied arms to the enemies of the government of California?
Francisco replied, I'm supplying guns to the enemies, but rather the friends. But I'm not supplying guns to the enemies, but rather the friends of the people of California. Those people under your command have no God and no law. They have placed a flagpole, on the flagpole, a rag that has a bear painted on it. And it is the same thing as saying that they are thieves. Forgetting that. When Lieutenant Archibald Gillespie asked if she had any weapons, Francisca stated that she had 4 pistols which are locked in her dresser and will stay there, so that she can defend her honor and the lives of her daughters in case some of the bears care to barge in. As we have seen, Vallejo was no longer happy with his educated daughters, was not always happy with his educated daughter's life choices, but his frustration with him never led him to express the slightest regret of having children educated. Throughout the treatment of education in Vallejo's writings, his overall point was that the Californianos were concerned about education, and they were even more interested and accomplished in cultural refinement than Europeans and Americans. As he approvingly quoted Ron Baptista Alvarado in another,
The Yankees have money on the brain.
the third theme of Vallejo's Recuerdos was the attempt to describe the complicated relationship between the Californianos and the indigenous people. In common with many leading colonists in Spanish America, Vallejo divided the indigenous into 2 groups. The Gentile, who remained outside the Spanish orbit and were often called Mongolos, and neophytes, who were involved in the Spanish system. Regarding the non-mission Indians, Vallejo described this whole effort to conquer the Indians in the north of Sonoma as an example of the Roman policy, divide and conquer. The reference to Rome was appropriate because Vallejo always thought of himself as a patriarch to the people he thought were lower in social class than himself, whether indigenous or otherwise. He helped Chief Solano fight against traditional enemies. He also used Solano's warriors to subdue other groups. In his manuscript, Vallejo consistently conflated the number of indigenous people against whom he battled, as well as those who he successfully subdued. Everybody blows up the story. By saying this, Vallejo was aligning himself with the traditional Spanish imperial struggle against the indigenous, especially the Apache and the Comanche. Also, he was writing his manuscript just as the American military were waging huge wars against the Plains Indians. Vallejo's message was that Americans were no different than the Spanish Mexicans. They wanted the land. Vallejo's opinion of the neophytes stemmed from his belief that the mission system was a failure at acculturating indigenous people. He reported favorably about a speech given by Geraldo Pacheco at the Mission San Juan Capistrano. According to Vallejo, Geraldo informed them of their present condition as being horrible, and they would be kept in a state of ignorance, and the education they would be giving was more fitting for slaves than a free man. In other words, the missions, in his view, failed due to the lack of acculturation and lack of education. The fourth theme is the nature of historical memories. Vallejo's relationship with Herbert Bancroft displayed this very clearly, as well as is well known. Bancroft thought of himself as the sole author of his historical works. He didn't want anybody. even though in his own day, he was roundly criticized for not recognizing his staff's efforts and discoveries in producing 39 volumes of work. Bancroft's work is huge. Vallejo and Bancroft were very different in this regard. Vallejo thought of his manuscript, he believed it was a part of a community effort. The time Vallejo spent with Cerruti was crucial to solidify his conviction of that his work was community-based. Bancroft wanted Vallejo to introduce Cerruti to California's early documents that Bancroft wanted to acquire for his research. But as Vallejo and Cerruti were traveling around California, Vallejo convinced these people, that as a condition of giving Cerruti documents, they first tell Cerruti their own story. Vallejo followed his own advice, and when Cerruti interviewed Vallejo's brother Salvador, my great-grandmother's ex-husband, along with the widow of Chief Solano. So Salvador and Chief Solano knew each other. These interviews occurred long before Vallejo began to give his information to Cerruti. We just found out some interesting information. Vallejo strongly believed that such community reminiscences were a crucial part of the history of California. As he engaged in these discussions in August 1874, Vallejo wrote to Alvarado and said,
Before we die, we need to narrate the true history of our country, since we have been so apathetic in writing it all down.
Vallejo relies on community recollection. In the prologue of his manuscript, he acknowledges many Californianos, all of whom he said had encouraged him on in his efforts. Vallejo also believed that the accurate community memory of the past will help those presently and in the future to understand exactly what transpired. This approach came at odds with many other writers due to the beneficial American expansion and the manifest destiny, which crowd out actual living experiences here in the West. Vallejo, however, believed that the fantasies of the particular present, such as the romanticization of the mission era by later writers, should not be allowed to define the past. He also argued that the present could not be adequately understood without a nuanced appreciation of the contribution of all, including the rank and file of the Mexican military personnel. Vallejo's own cultural presuppositions certainly blinded him to the way he often excluded indigenous people from the consideration, but his own limited views don't destroy the validity of the perspective he developed. Finally, Vallejo hoped that his work could inspire greater understanding and appreciation of the crucial role Californianos played in the development of California in the West. He believed this would help lead to a greater acceptance of the Mexican-American community to which he belonged, as being genuine members of contemporary California. As he stated in his prologue, California has been delegated to the height of prosperity by the sons of the founding generations of California. He hoped that this history of those could convince those with then prevalent notions, which was that the California wealth came from the gold rush and from the Americans present in the region, was not true. He also hoped that his work would help the Anglo-American Californianos to genuinely appreciate the Spanish and Mexican roots of contemporary California, and would encourage more understanding and sympathy to those tied with early pioneer roots. In the last paragraph of his manuscript, he bluntly states,
I declare that despite the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the North Americans treat the Californianos as a conquered people.
He strongly believed that one way to accrete understanding was for the Anglos to learn more about the unfamiliar role in their midst, and of the unfamiliar people in their midst. In the same final section of his manuscript, he observed,
French and German are taught in our schools, Why not Spanish?
An analogous question we still confront today. 1,506 pages were done by him in 1865. As I said earlier, Kate Bancroft had a description of Catholic language she wrote out with her father. And, you know, here's this little picture of Mariano Guadalupe or Langan. And I beg for your time today. Thank you for listening to this boring story, but it's exciting for me because I have roots. And I think you all have roots. And it did have something to do with this area. I can answer some questions, but Kate described him at the very end. This is how she described him.
General Vallejo was rather short and thick. He wears side whiskers. Instead of letting them grow down naturally, he stops them just off of his mouth, which makes him look very funny and deep. He has a very funny hat too.
That's it.
Oh.
That's my presentation, but it's also the presentation from the author. These books are absolute treasures. I would say at the very least, you ought to have a set for the Historical Society. And so that you can just read them. And it's like I said, in history, you read and read and read and finding, that's what you're looking for. And it's only a sentence.
Can you give us the contract information?
Yes, I will leave it with Kim. I'll make sure they have.
Any questions?
Current future, thank you. Do you have a couple stories out of the about the Berryessa?
Well, I do. So how you got to the north? As I told you, there was a killing of the Berryessas, what they call them in America. It was on the beach of San Rafael. Unfortunately, when Kit Carson and John Fremont did their deed at around 3 in the morning, there were some guys camped over here. Their names were O'Farrell, Ellis, Kearney, all the San Francisco streets. They were all, this was where you went across. This was where you crossed the San Francisco Bay. So if you wanted to go north to Eureka, you walked all the way from San Francisco down to San Jose, all the way up to Contra Costa, the Coast, up to Point Richmond. And you cross right there where the brothers lighthouse. That's where you get into the water, because in the middle of the night it's calm. Well, the reason you took that route was because going north through the woods wasn't possible. That wasn't possible until we took the training, and my grandfather, her grandson, her grandson-in-law, he was the surveyor for the training going north. The reason 101 is there is because that's the service road. So until then, to get to Eureka, they had to go to Marino Guadalupe's Adobe. So that was one of the first stops. So they went across at San Rafael, and they would find their way to the Petaluma Adobe. That was stop number. Stop number 2 was the other in Sonoma. Now the reason they're going up is because the water table was much higher back then. So in the winter, you couldn't go down where it really bad. Everything is up. So they would get to the second Adobe Sonoma, and you think that it would be 1 day's travel between places, and all. It was usually about a week, and then you stay 2 or 3 weeks to recover, get more supplies, and guess where one of the other stops was? Peña. After you left the Peña and back up, but by the way, Chief Solana, when he died, nobody really knew what had happened. And it was Vaca who, in a letter to Mariano Vallejo, which I read, he says, "What happened to Solana?" And they called him something else. They didn't call him Solana. And said, "Oh, we heard he died about you." That was the only. So after you leave Peña, the next stop would be Winters, but more up on the hill. But guess where the Berryessa is? Buda Creek. So what they think, and I've had talked with some people here at the Dixon, they may have gone through the Buda Creek. Exactly. Because the next stop was basically up in the hill from Williams. And there's a story for Stonyford, little town from Stonyford. What is it? Stonyford. That's one of the stops.
Yeah.
That's one of the stops. So as you keep going north, you end up near Willows. And Willows, if you go up to Willows and up to Elk Creek, that's one of the other stops. So it's Fruto, where this picture is taken, you see there, is where the Berryessa is. So the Berryessa were at Buda Creek. I'm leaving for you. The Berryessa that lived in Buda Creek ran basically a way bridge at the stagecoach. And I have two original letters here, and I have some of my family history if you want. I will make it available to you. These are letters from that stop near Buda Creek, and he's asking. This is the actual translation of it. It's hard to read. Legible writing. They're asking for a barrel of whiskey, 3 boxes of cigars. You know, it's not fruits and vegetables. They want the real deal. You know, so it's an interesting. It's an interesting little look at what they did. And so if you go from Elk Creek and Fruto, the way you got to Eureka is you went up the Alder Creek until you got to Blocksburg and a town called Alder. My grandmother, her granddaughter, my grandmother, met my grandfather who was surveying for the railroad. He was on one side of the Eel River and she was on the other. And 4 days later they got married. But she was already engaged to another man. But the picture of my grandfather, he wore the blue stuff and lace stuff all over. So I think he was pretty bad. But anyway, the Berryessa clan also owned the new Almaden mine, which John Fremont went down and shot 11 of them and hung them because he wanted that mine. The mine was important because it was quicksilver. It's the #1 EPA cleanup site in the world right now. They don't know what to do. You can't go in there. They can't touch it. It was ochre, so they found the Indians with putting this orange powder on their face, and the Indians were really weird. That they thought it was monks. They were putting mercury on the bottom. Ochre is mercury. So when Fremont found the mine, he killed everybody, tried to take it over. It went back to the Mexicans a couple of times, but without the mercury mine there, the gold rush wouldn't have happened. So they smelled the gold. So that's one kind of weird thing. Of course, there's Berryessa Road down in San Jose off of 680. That's their entire area, and where the Berryessas that I'm speaking of are buried is the Mission San Jose in 680. She was baptized in the Santa Clara Mission, which no longer exists, part of the seminary. You know, the school was Santa Clara.
When did your family first arrive here? What year?
So 1774, they were brother and sister. I am a docent for the National Park Service for the animal trail, so I get asked to do public every once in a while. Mom, who was passed away now, he was the one who's translated all the early documents, the Viceroy, and you know all the documents creating the expedition on the Anza expedition. And he was stationed at Tubac, which is in southern Arizona. So I've been down there many times. And he and I came to the conclusion that those two children found their way from Sinaloa to Frontera on their own. Frontera is about 40 or 50 miles south of the Arizona-Mexican border. So how did those two kids get there? We don't know. How did they get included in the expedition? We don't know, because they're the only two that didn't have parents. He did marry a Peralta, and they were written. Anza includes everybody chronologically, so first, second, third. So they are down towards the bottom. There's a couple of movers that are added after them, but right in front of them is the Gonzalez thing. And I've pressed relatives about that to see if there's any story. So the problem with my history and my focus is early Alta California, early. It's really hard to get good documentation. That's why I collect so many books, because someone may say, it was said, or something like that. And so I focus on early. I mean, even I can go back to the 1600s. There's a lot of the Spaniards which came from San Sebastian. Kim and I were talking about earlier, from San Sebastian is where they came. A lot of them were Basque. They came in the 1640s, 1650s. I want to pass on, well, for the Berryessa family, I wanted to let you know that my grandmother was discovered by my grandfather in Bloxburg, the Gill River. This is in the middle of nowhere. They grow marijuana up there. Okay? I mean, it's like nothing is up there. But back then, Bloxburg was like a railway station, because that's where the wagons went. Within a day, you just went up the Gill River, which is the way the train went. So the Berryessas were kind of like managers of way stations. And so honestly, I haven't discovered, the Berryessas are in here to talk about the Berryessas, but I haven't discovered the direct connection between my relative and Mariano. But for sure they knew each other. There was only so many people here back then. For sure, that was the way. That was the way. I want to give one last little story, because I think as Californians and Californianos, you should know. Cortez, Geraldo Cortez, who conquered Mexico, Montezuma and everything, he went back to Spain. And by the way, the Spanish did go back and forth quite often. The missionaries, once you were here as a Mexican or a new Spaniard, you go back. There was another Cortez. His name was Joaquin Cortez. He was up in Tucson, near Tucson. He saw the Casa Grande. He went and got all the way over to Yuma, where the river is, Colorado River. And it was summer. And the river was down. The Indian said, it was good, we can go across. He looked over and he saw the desert on the other side. It was just like, you know how hot. And he said, no, not going there. said caliente forno. You know what I just said? What did I just say? Forno. Furnace, hot as a furnace. California, that's weird. That's how it got.
California guy's name?
Joaquin Cortez.
Yeah.
Was an explorer, they were the queen,
Yeah.
and they were trying to find their way across the desert. And he got to Yuma. And the Colorado River, which was down. The Indians said, you can cross. And he looked and he said, no. Caliente forno. And that got it. So they always knew, where are you trying to go to? California. The hot furnace. And just so you may put two pieces together, Anza did get through the desert. He found his way through. They didn't use it as a main source, it just was too far. But when he did it, guess when he did it? December. Okay. They knew.
And how did Berryessa Lake, this, obviously that's your family, and so you know how that came to fruition?
In the 1850s, in this era, they were gambling. Now, back in those days, everybody gambled. And by the way, the Indians gambled with the Californianos, California. It was one of the things they did together. And it wasn't necessarily card games. They didn't really have cards. They just bet. You had a button. You bet it. Well, so the Berryessas that were handling Cooper Creek got in trouble on some gambling, from what I know. And the person who they got in trouble with was a lawyer. And so he got control of the property. They did argue vociferously. No. The lawyer was never able to prove his ownership. But the Berryessas couldn't either, because back then, the American system used a longitude and a latitude. Okay? But the way the Berryessas had it, it said, well, we get it from that rock to that stream. So there was not a meeting of the minds. Usually they had some kind of meeting of the minds, but it meant that most of the property was lost. In this case, all. However, there was a cloud on the property. The state finally, because there were so many lawsuits, said no, it's public property. In 1950. So that's how it got to me. So it was in limbo for 60 years. In legal limbo. And the Berryessas lost. So the Berryessas lost a lot of their original property through thievery, through squatting, but that's the way it was with a lot of California. I was saying earlier that these folks are unbelievable. And I've talked about this particular subject with Langan. And what they're happy about is that Bancroft is now putting on their websites and they're digitizing all of the original land grant. So you can go back and trace original documents. And that may take a while, but that is a really big deal to just tell the story about it all the time. Because, a stupid little relative and descendant like me, what do I don't know nothing. So I don't think anyone will ever claim anything. It's nice to be able to say what happened. And that's kind of what Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo was saying, that even though I think he was wrong, I will say this about my experience in finding things out about my own history and history of everything. I hate it. So, You know, you find out some great things. You find out some things that sometimes doesn't like that, you know? 100 paddles? Come on. Anyway, thank you very much for your time. I'm leaving this stuff here so we can kind of play with it. And I know that I was supposed to talk maybe a little bit more about the Berryessas, but honestly, the Berryessas, the Peñas, Vallejos, they're all connected. I am a legitimate ancestor, and I found out that I can bury them with them.
I think it's wonderful to realize that this land, you know, there are many layers. And different people who occupied this land, and it's fascinating to go, you know, beyond 1868 is when Dixon was established, but I find it fascinating to know what came before and who was here. And even the townships, we have Tremont, Sullyville, and Main Prairie are the main townships that eventually merged to become Dixon. And those townships were created on the Mexican land grants all over in this area. So, and then of course the Wington who were here first. So it's just fascinating when you peel back all the layers.
The land to me, I can see the Indians in it. When I'm in Emeryville, I shell down there and they know the Indians live there for 5,000 years. Shell mounds, they found bones and stuff. So I have an innate way of seeing history. And I'm going to tell everybody a little. So my wife passed away 2011, so I put down my book. I was trying for a long time to write a book. She got cancer. And that's why it was my passion to kind of write a book about these two kids that came up from Sinaloa. There's something about that story to me. And so I started and I put it down. I'm going to finish it. It's kind of daily, like a diary kind of thing. So I stopped. Guess what I stopped? It's the Yuma River. It's just like I realized I had to create something else. So when I was putting the book down, not paying attention to it, my wife had died. My mom said to me, "Ken, you need to pick it up." But she had read it because there's half of the book. And she said, you got to put the voice of who's telling the story. You got to find the right voice. You don't have a voice. It took me about a year or two. So I sat down and I wrote this story about a lady, Clara, who's sitting on a rock and has tears coming down her face because she's tired, but the granddaughter is sitting next to her and she's crying. And she goes, "Well, Grandma, why don't you tell me a story about me?" So I started off with rather about my lady sitting on the porch and walking through the granddaughter. A year and a half later, it gives me chills just thinking about it. I'm up at the Willows Cemetery going to look at the cemetery where she's buried, and he pulls out this picture. I can tell you, I almost described this perfect. So I don't know about that. I'll pick up a book and say.
And we have time to mingle, and if you have further questions for Kendall, if you'd like to look at the books and materials he's brought, feel free to do so. And thank you so much for being here, all of you.